think that it's just gone the way it's gone. If I could introduce Gavin Bye from Health and Safety, and I'll let him do anything else for me.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Gavin Bye. I'm head of HSE's Construction Sector Policy Unit. It's the bit of HSE's construction division that links everything we do in workplaces to all of the various stakeholders in the construction industry, whether that be Parliament through regulation and rewriting regulations over the years, whether it be through trade associations, industry bodies, whether it be through communications activity that we undertake. I have 5 teams who cover a range of different topics. And effectively take that information that we get from the industry and from Parliament and translate it into what our inspectors do. So we train our inspectors, we set their programmes of work, we set the standards that we want them to work to, that we want to achieve. It's wrong or too loud. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. Right, what I wanted to talk to you today about was where HSE fits into temporary demountable structures in the entertainment and events industry. I wanted to give you a bit about the policy background, about why we're involved at all, because we didn't used to be involved. Some people still don't know we're involved. Why we made that decision to change on policy, how the construction division works, so you know how we've worked with the construction industry and how we would then hope to work with the events and entertainment industry. A bit about what our inspectors have been finding when they've been in the field over the last work year, which is coming to a close now in the end of March. A bit about a working group we've set up with the Joint Advisory Committee on Entertainment to hopefully take forward with the industry some of the key issues in terms of safety, both of the structures themselves and of the people related to the people who erect them and dismantle them. And a bit about what we've got planned for our field work next year, what our inspectors will be doing in 2012-13. The policy background goes back to the Temporary and Mobile Construction Sites Directive in 1992, which had a specific definition of the word construction work, or the phrase construction work. It's a very wide, broad definition which could apply to virtually anything you ever do, to any kind of structure. It was deliberately meant to be a very expansive definition. It was translated into UK legislation, or GB legislation, in 1994 in the Construction Design and Management Regulations, and the definition of what construction work was taken directly from the directive, so it mirrors it. HSE policy at that time was that we did not consider temporary demountable structures in the events industry, stages, tents, grandstands, to be structures within the definitions of the directive and our regulations. So they were excluded our decision was that the CDM regulations from 1994 did not apply to temporary demountable structures. And that went as far as the Director General at the time of HSE writing to the Institute of Structural Engineers to confirm that position. So HSE was not involved at all in enforcement work on health and safety standards in the industry. It was entirely felt to local authority inspectors. And there was some logic to that, because local authorities have responsibility for licensing legislation which applies to some events, so it was a consistent sort of approach. CDM was rewritten in the early 2000s and eventually came into force with CDM 2007. And the policy line was the same. CDM did not apply to temporary demountable structures. Peculiarly, in the 2007 regulations, there's actually a specific exemption in the approved code of practice for marquees and other similar structures, which was put in at the request of part of the industry at the time. It's a bit of an odd one because it's only one small part of the temporary demountable structures world, but it appears in the approved code of practice. So our policy line was maintained and had been consistent over that time. Then the Olympics came along, and during the big build, we were heavily involved in the early stages of the planning of that work, with probably a lighter touch whilst the work was actually being carried out. We were heavily involved in discussions then about what would happen when LOCOG became the client and how they would manage the erection of temporary structures. And LOCOG took the decision that they wished to apply CDM principles to the management of that process. And that kicked off a big conversation between us and bits of the industry about whether CDM actually applied or not, and whether local should be doing this or shouldn't be doing this. So we re-looked at the issue again, the definition of construction. And if you look at the definition of construction in plain English, there's no question that it applies, or it covers, the kind of work that's done in the events industry. There's no question about it, that's a matter of fact. If you look at European guidance, which had come out in 2000, I think it was 2008, 2009, on how the directive should be implemented, it actually mentions a temporary seating as being an example of a structure, and therefore being putting it up, taking it down, being construction work. So there was no hiding from the fact that actually our policy decision from the 90s had been wrong. It wasn't correct in law. But there are consequences of that. If you then say it is construction work, CDM applies to it, the whole of the regulations apply to it. Different requirements kick in at different stages and different sizes of projects, but the regulations as a whole would apply. And with that, if it's construction work, the enforcing authority changes. Local authorities don't enforce, well, they enforce very minor parts of the construction work. The vast majority of construction work is enforced by HSE, and that's enshrined in a set of regulations. So local authorities don't actually have any powers on a construction site. Their powers are limited to those activities that are specified in the enforcing authority legislation. So those are the consequences. During that period of discussion with local, we had some informal discussions with people from the entertainment industry, from the construction industry, and internally in HSE with our units that deal specifically with the entertainment industry about what would be the implications for us applying CDM as it is to the industry, in comparison to the legislation which existed at the time and which the industry was following, hopefully following, but which applied to the industry, the management regs, the whole other suite of regulation that applies to other industries. We came to the conclusion that CDM didn't actually provide a useful framework for the entertainment industry. It had been written and rewritten specifically for the construction procurement process. It was rewritten in 2007, and one of the aims in 2007 was to make it better apply to certain new types of contracts that had appeared over the period from the 94 regulations, things like PFI. And we felt it didn't provide a useful framework. What existed already was a useful framework, and was one that the industry could understand and could follow. So our decision was that although you could not argue that the CDM regulations applied, HSE would choose not to enforce them in this sector. But as it is construction work as defined, HSE would have to take over enforcing authority responsibility for the industry, so fall to HSE. And the decision was made, the best place to put that within HSE in terms of those people who actually carry out the proactive inspection and investigation work would be with the construction division, because that was the industry it was most similar to. Obviously that then has significant issues around the interface between our work and local authorities' work, because local authority licensing legislation continued in place, and that cuts across some of the requirements of the Health and Safety at Work Act. And our initial approach to it was that we wouldn't become too much involved in the structural side of the work. We were more concerned about the safety and the health and safety of those people involved in erecting and dismantling the structures. So for a particular event, enforcing authority responsibility would change during the actual process. The construction work, beginning the erection of the temporary demountable structures, that would be HSE, as it's construction work. The event would fall to the local authorities who have responsibility for licensing, and when the event finishes, the dismantling would fall back to HSE as construction work. So that was our initial approach at the start of the last work year. And I'll come back to how we've slightly changed that approach and changed our views on what we should do in relation particularly to structural safety. A little bit now about how we work in the construction division. We've had a programme running since about 2000 with the construction industry, which at the time in 2000 had particularly bad health and safety record. It's still not a great record, it's a lot better than it was. At the time, 2000, the number of deaths in the construction was running at over 100 per year. And in 2000-2001, there was a sharp increase in the number of deaths. Something like a third more deaths occurred in that year, around the time of an increase in volume of work in the construction industry. And it became apparent at ministerial level. John Prescott became concerned with it as head of our sponsor department. And he called a ministerial summit in 2001 of all the large organisations in the construction industry. And basically said to them, it either gets sorted out under the current regulatory framework or we will regulate further to sort it out. And that was a real turning point in the industry. It was the start of what we call the construction programme, which had three themes. Ownership, primarily the responsibility for managing risk falls with the industry that creates it. It's the construction industry that creates the risk, it's their job to manage it. It's not HSE's job to manage it for them, it's their job to manage it. Leadership, this needs to be both led by the industry as a whole and led within organisations by the people who lead those organisations. The responsibility falls at the highest levels of directors and managers. And one of partnership, both partnership between HSE and the industry to help solve the problems, but also partnership within the industry itself between the managers and the workers. And from that, the construction division was formed as a national division in HSE, solely devoted to the construction industry, with a ring-fenced resource, with all of the aspects of HSE's work all falling within one division. So my side, the policy side, the standard setting side, the inspectorate itself, and also our specialist construction inspectors who provide specialist advice on construction engineering issues. The construction programme, which we developed in those early 2000s, was very heavily evidence-based, based on where the accidents and ill health was occurring, why it was occurring, which problems could be solved, which ones couldn't, and which ones should be prioritised first, which bits of the industry should we focus on. And it was that evidence and the design of the programme was very heavily influenced by the industry itself. I've put the construction industry advisory committee as an example. That's a committee that we run, similar to the Joint Advisory Committee on Education. But there were a whole range of ways that we interacted with the industry at a high level. The Strategic Forum for Construction, the United Kingdom Contractors Group, a variety of different groups. And they became engaged in what we were doing and had an influence over what we would do with the industry and what we would target. So it wasn't just about inspection and enforcement, but where we were going to do inspection and enforcement, we targeted it at the highest risk activities, for example, roof work, and the highest risk parts of the sectors, parts of the industry, for example, refurbishment or small sites. We had a range of approaches to dealing with the industry, not just, as I said, not just inspection and enforcement. We had communication initiatives, we had supply chain projects where we would bring together an entire supply chain for a particular issue, from the clients all the way down to the workers, the trades unions, and develop solutions with them that they agreed were reasonably practical and they would implement, which we then backed up later with enforcement action. A good example of that would be curb cutting. Manual curb cutting without extraction, without wetting down, creates an enormously high level of crystalline silica in the air, and it exposes people to vast quantities of the dust. We agreed with the industry itself, with the clients, the local authorities, the people who procure the roadworks, with the manufacturers of the equipment, new designs and ways of working, which they agreed to and they signed up to. We gave the industry some time to implement it, and then a year or two later, our inspectors went out and enforced on it. And you've seen that there's been a dramatic shift in the performance of that industry and that particular sector on that particular issue. We improved our guidance. Our guidance has traditionally been written, apologies to anybody who's a safety professional, but it's traditionally been written for safety professionals. People who run construction companies aren't safety professionals, particularly in the small side of the industry. They don't even have access to safety professionals. So we improved the way we wrote it so people would understand it, and it became much more basic. And that's developed over the 10 years to the point where we now do a number of things called busy builder sheets, which tell people exactly what they have to do and show them in pictures what they have to do and what they shouldn't do in pictures. And we also updated the CDM regulations in 2007 as part of that. So that's sort of a brief run round, 10 years worth of work with the industry as to how we work with an industry. We're not just about turning up on site, saying you do this, you don't do that, you don't do the other, and then leaving you with all the problems. We are about working with an industry to develop solutions that the industry can actually deliver. That doesn't mean we accept everything an industry says and just go with what they say. We will challenge where we think challenge is necessary. We will take on board the views of the industry. A little bit about what we found in the last year in our sort of first full year of carrying out inspection work. Our approach was deliberately, cautious is not the right word, but it wasn't a gung-ho approach, go out and enforce, serve notices, have a massive impact. It was really about learning about how the industry works. So we gave each of our construction teams around the country a target for a number of events that they should go and visit. And we started off at the higher end of the industry, so go and visit these 2 large events in your patch this year. Things like I would normally, if I was talking to the industry, I would put up lots of photographs of what we found to show you the sorts of things we found. We can't do that in your industry because you all recognise exactly who the people are in the photographs. So we've made a conscious decision not to shame anybody by showing photographs of poor practice. But our approach was very much that one of listening and discussing, but pushing at the same time, but not taking lots of enforcement action. Where inspectors thought they would need to take enforcement action, we asked them to refer back to the centre to discuss it first. So the visits were carried out over the year. This will be no surprise to you. The key problems our inspectors came across initially, primarily work at height. And that includes the whole range of iffy temporary work at height you would find in many workplaces. People working on pallets on forklifts, people using broken ladders, all those kind of things, but also a number of industry-specific work at height issues, particularly around the leading edges of stages and decking out of seating. Workplace transport, a particular issue. And I suppose this really reflects back to the bigger issue of the management of the overall site. Not just the temporary demountable structures being erected, but all the other things that are going on around it. So the particular issues were really around segregation of pedestrians, people at work, from moving the plant. Lifting was another area. Some particularly complicated lifting activities taking place without any sort of planning. The sort of standards that we would expect in the construction industry not being reflected at all on the sites that our inspectors came to. Structural safety, that's why I put TDS. It became clear during the year that structural safety was something that we would have to address as an organisation. For a number of reasons. One reason being that our initial assumption around the fact that the local authorities had a good handle on this issue through licensing, it became apparent that wasn't a consistent picture across the country. Some local authorities were extremely professional, had the expertise in-house and dealt with the issue really well. Other local authorities didn't have that kind of resource level and weren't able to deal with the issues properly. So one of the lessons we learned was that this was an issue we were going to have to address as an organisation, decide where we sat in the process and what standards we would then expect from the industry. I mentioned about how the construction programme works. We want to, and I think we are, reflecting that approach with your industry. And one thing we've begun is a working group, a subgroup, not of the Construction Industry Advisory Committee, a subgroup of the Joint Advisory Committee on Entertainment. So it will report to them ultimately, not to Cognac. A working group that reflects the industry, so has a membership drawn from contractors, clients, designers, regulators, local authorities both as regulators and as clients in one case, and as a broad representative body of the industry, chaired by HSE and all the backup and everything will come from HSE. But with that in mind, is to try and recreate in a smaller way what we did with the construction industry. We don't see the problems in terms of health and safety with the events industry as being anything like the scale that they were in the early 2000s with the construction industry. We do see things where there's room for improvement, the sort of things you've been discussing this morning, and also about the safety of people carrying out work. We do see room for improvement, and we think this is the best way to move that forward in conjunction with the industry. The structure of the way we're going to work within the working group is to have, where we've identified specific issues, we will form smaller groups of people who are directly interested in that particular issue to develop solutions and bring them back to the wider group for agreement, then promulgate them to industry, and then, as I said, we've done with supply chain initiatives in future years, start enforcing against those standards to make sure that there's a level playing field across the industry. People are doing the things they've agreed to do. We first met in February 2012. I'll go through the actions from that particular meeting. We were really pleased with the enthusiastic and constructive response we got from everybody we invited to the group, everyone we've spoken to the group about since and before. But before I go on to the actions from that, one thing that's worth mentioning that came up at the meeting was about the HSG 195, one of our publications, the events guide. I don't know if we've spoken about this already since over the last couple of days, but HSG 195 will not be republished by HSE. The safety elements of it will appear on HSE's website in an events safety section of the website. The rest of the document is being handed over to the Events Industry Forum. It's also new acronyms I have to get used to with the events industry, for them to take forward using what we've produced already, our health and safety input. They intend to produce a much wider guide to holding an event. The reason HSE weren't able to produce a much wider guide that covered more than just health and safety is partly down to government policy at the moment, that our guidance should be limited strictly to what we need to do to comply with our legislation. So we were unable to cover those other issues that people want in order to be able to manage an event. So the EIF will be taking that forward. Before I go to the actions of the working group, a little bit about the actual terms of reference for the working group. These are obviously initial and could change if other issues become more important, and it's not an inflexible set of rules that we will stick to. We were particularly concerned, especially after our first year's experience, about that poor safety practice in particular in the dismantling and erection of temporary structures. And identifying where compliance is poor and what we can do about it, but also coming up with practical solutions to those industry-specific problems. Not just imposing exactly what happens in construction on the industry, but trying to challenge the industry to come up with their own solutions to how this can be done safely. And some of you will have experienced some of that with the work we've been doing in the current year, where inspectors have been to site and discussed things they believe that they found unacceptable during their visits. But that. But the other key thing, which was the big change from where we were a year ago, is to look at good and poor practice in the management of structural stability. And we are particularly keen to identify and to promulgate the lessons that can be learned from the incidents that have happened over the last year around the world. That isn't as easy as you would think it would be for the HSE. You think we could just phone our counterparts in Belgium and get all the information we want. But our structure as the health and safety executive isn't reflected across the rest of Europe, let alone other parts of the world. So it takes more time and it's more difficult to do. And in some cases, people within the industry will have quicker access to the information than we would. But we are keen that these things, the events that have happened over the last year, those lessons are learned, and the same things aren't repeated in this country. This is just a flavour of the actions from the first meeting of the working group. We've set up two subgroups looking particularly at work at height, one on seating and staging, and one on multi-storey temporary buildings, to look at the issues, to come up with some solutions. As I said, we can get agreed with the industry. We need better guidance both for the industry and also for local authorities, so that we can work harmoniously with local authorities on what the law actually covers and what it doesn't cover, what is construction work, what isn't construction work. There will always be grey areas, but where there are grey areas we need to be clear that HSE will work with the local authority to make that a smooth transition for whoever the particular duty holder is. And we don't want people being confused about who the enforcing authority is or whether the legislation applies and what legislation doesn't apply. As I said on the previous slide, better information on recent incidents so that we can learn in the same way the construction industry has learned from disasters over the years and not make the same mistakes. I know you've had a debate about guidance on structural stability in the last day or so. As HSE, we see the I-Struct-T guidance as being the benchmark we will use during our inspection work. That's not to say that it couldn't be improved, there aren't things that could be done, but at the moment we see that as being what our inspectors will look for in terms of the management process that's followed for temporary structures. Our inspectors in the field are not structural engineers. They have access to specialist structural engineers where they might need them. They are experts in management systems and health and safety, and they will be looking in relation to that particular risk for that sort of benchmark standard from duty holders. I put as a question mark because it's something we're looking into after the first meeting as to whether we need better management guidance for the industry, perhaps going as far as a model for how an event should be managed. Using the language of the industry to say who should be doing what when. That sort of stuff already exists for the construction industry, but it doesn't really for the entertainment industry. Finally, quickly, what we'll be doing this year. We have an intervention plan, LOCOG, obviously is the biggest part of the sector this year, probably. We intervened early with LOCOG and asked them to set standards for all of the people who were doing work under their control. We'll be doing sample inspections of that during the year to make sure people are doing what it was they were asked to do. Last year we asked our teams to look at large events. This year we're asking our teams to concentrate more on the next level down of events. We believe that your industry mirrors the construction industry, and as a general rule, the smaller the site gets, the less expertise and potentially the worse the standards are. So we'll be looking at the next tier down. Potentially some around the cultural Olympiad work, but it could be any other events as well. Our field teams will use local intelligence and speak to local authorities about events to choose those events that they choose to inspect. The working group will continue, and we want to start delivering solutions so that we don't lose the impetus of the Olympics. It's something we've done with the industry. We've drawn lessons from the Olympics big build to share with the industry, and we'd like to do it with this as well. We'd like to maintain that impetus. And we'll be looking at what we find to really start to determine how much effort as an organisation we need to put into the industry. How much time should we be spending with your industry as against the backdrop of the whole spectrum of the construction industry. We don't just inspect people for the sake of it. We have to prioritise the limited resources we have to the highest risk areas. So after 2 years, we will have a much clearer picture of the level of performance of the industry and be able to target that much better. So we may well, our approach will evolve over the next year or two. Right, that was it. Any questions?
Who met up the working group that you were speaking about?
Who met?
Up the working group? What types of people make up the working group?
Rudi's one. We have some local authority people. We have major staging companies. We have seating contractors. People from Muta. Yeah. So, we'll get to a stage where we can actually publish the details of the site. There are about 20 plus people in the group. I can show. I've probably got a list of the names in the document at the back. I can show you. It's as broad a church as we can get for the industry. Because there's no point in just dealing with one bit. You've got to deal with the other bit. I think the discussion I was having really before, one of the keys to improving the construction industry was that holistic approach, and in particular, getting to the clients. Because if you look at the Olympic big build, the ODA as a client took that client performance to a new level almost with their delivery partner CNA. And that was what we would see as the key thing that influenced the high standards that were demonstrated on the Olympic site.
In relation to CDM, the HSE chosen not to enforce, but still CDM standards are legal required. Do you see a time when the HSE might reverse that decision, or that CDM might be rewritten in CDM 2000 or whatever, where the events industry is taken out of it?
I think if it was rewritten, we would probably look to see if we could write it in a way that it could apply to the industry. But obviously we'd do that by talking to the industry. Which I wouldn't say for certain whether that's possible or not possible at the moment, to be honest.
It has been suggested that there would be an EDM
EDM.
instead of construction events.
I mean, as someone who doesn't have much experience in the industry from inspection work, I would say, looking at the evidence the stuff that I've seen so far, what appears to me to be the crucial issue is how the whole thing is organised and who's in charge of the whole thing. Very much like a construction site. One person in control of the construction phase makes it much easier to manage. And it's that level of control is where the issue. If you don't have that control, you have problems. If you do have that level of control, you can manage it quite, the risks aren't that unusual.
And the difference is the duty holders and the CDM duty holder names into...
Yes. It will be force fit, yeah.
Yeah, and so supposing that force fit, you've got weaken CDM construction so it can fit us as well, or rewrite. So,
I don't know if it would weaken it or not, but you'd have to rewrite it. You would have to...
you have to weaken the duty or widen. At the moment it's quite a detailed duty holders responsibility.
Yes, yeah.
Applies to construction. To make it apply better for our industry, it means widening or loosening that.
Yes, we've been changing it so that it would cover those kind of procurement
Do
arrangements.
you think that's a thing that's actually happening, or we can be seen to be that close to the construction industry? Because obviously there's a lot of differences.
I would want to wait to see what comes out of the way that Locog have run the projects that they've been involved in, and what lessons we could learn from that, about what worked and what didn't work with the approach that they took. But obviously that's the top tier of the industry. So whether that would... For us in construction, our biggest problem are small sites. 3/4 of the people who die in construction die on a site with less than 15 people. Generally run by SMEs or micro businesses. So our legislation historically has been in conjunction with the top levels of the industry, because that's where the problem was in 2000 and in the 90s. Perhaps we should now be looking to write something that the small end of the industry can deal with, which I'm sure the same lessons would apply in the events industry as well.
So with your field work this year, where you're focusing on the lower tier of events, are you going to take a softly approach like you did this year just gone with the larger events, or are you going to enforce?
I think well, it wasn't softly is not probably not a good description of the approach we took this year. This year, we made people aware that there were certain things that were industry-specific issues. The thing about staging, the thing about seating. If we find people on pallets on forklift trucks, doesn't matter what industry you're in, you're going to get a prohibition notice. So that kind of level of enforcement would continue. Around the other issues, we will be developing those solutions over the next 6 months to a year, hopefully, and then rolling out enforcement lines against that. But even where we did find those issues this year, inspectors have been pushing contractors to come up with solutions. They haven't been serving notices and prosecuting people, but they have been challenging and pushing people. Sorry for that.
Seems like one of your things on the area of concern is the front edge lead and edge of the decking tank. If you look at the construction industry, you've got about 4 different standards of where that applies. You've got guys that use full rest when they're laying for them. You've got scaffolders which work on an unprotected edge, which work on
there's 4 different standards to start with, but then the standard is the legislation. The legislation is the work at height regulations, which gives you a hierarchy of things you can do. First thing being, as with any sort of risk management process, can you eliminate the risk? Do you have to work at height at all? So in construction, that would be things like, can you prefabricate it on the ground and then lift it up, rather than having people bolting it up, working in the air. But for each of those things, I mean, things like the edge protection for scaffolders has changed dramatically over the last 10 years, and now we should not find scaffolders working at unprotected edges in any similar way to what you would have found 10, 15 years ago. The latest guidance produced by the National Association of Scaffolding Contractors limits the amount of open edge working with a harness to a very small part of the construction of the scaffold. Because there are other safer ways of doing it, things like leading edge guardrails and things that you could lift from below and fit before you go and work on a platform. There will be some combination of all those things that would be appropriate for your industry. We're not trying to stop people working and make it possible for people to work. We want a solution that is practical and practicable. Because if it's not, it won't be followed. I don't know what it will be at the moment, but it will be something we will agree with the industry.
Yeah, because some of us have quite a lot of talking about how to get over the kind of just ask more, more due compliant, because like you look at different areas of construction, which there aren't there now.
Yeah, well, the edge protection and excavation should be the same as it is on a scaffold. It should be the same for a brickie. The legislation's the same. You should have edge protection at the edge of a ditch in the ground that someone's just dug. Whether you do or not is a matter of performance of the individual contractors. So I would see it as being bespoke solutions to the particular issue. And very often, and this is true of scaffold erection, the actual solution to the problem wasn't to talk about the leading edge that was there, it was to talk about why the leading edge was there in the first place, and it was there because of the sequence in which things were done. And by changing the sequence in the way you put up scaffolding, you can eliminate most of those open edges. And I would imagine a lot of the stuff that's used for temporary seating and staging is scaffolding type material. If you start to look at the sequence in which things are done, you can eliminate lots of the risk without even having to worry about how you're going to put particular guardrails up. That's where I would imagine the solution is.
I made the comment yesterday about different constructions being separated by industry rather than engineering principles. So a scaffold with a timber deck and a frame and a fabric cover can be a stage, a dodge and track, a hospitality unit, and from an engineering point of view it doesn't make any difference, and I'm sure what you've just said applies across all industries.
Yeah.
My difficulty is trying to work out which questions I really want to ask you.
If you ask me a couple now, you can ask me some more over lunch.
We had some debate yesterday. Could you just clarify for us what the status of the BSEM is, and what our compulsion to comply with that is, and what the limits on that compulsion?
Which BSEM are you talking about?
13782.
Any BSEM. Any. What is the status of an EM requirement, especially if that?
I mean, in terms of where we would place it when we're looking at as a benchmark standard.
Yes, or whether one can vary from that and use your own risk assessment.
None of them are legal requirements.
Thank you. Secondly, and this is we sat on a panel back in February last year, which you may or may not have expunged from your memory, where I suggested that the new arrangements may result in a vacuum or a lack of inspection and enforcement, which I think a lot of people in this room actually would fear more than over-enforcement, because you're probably talking to a room that are converted here. So is there the possibility that, given the limited resources of the HSE and the fact you haven't got an inspector in every parish, is there a possibility that some of these enforcement duties that you say have now devolved back to the HSE might get re-tasked to the local authority? Or are we in a situation where actually during the construction and dismantling phases, we're going to have far less regulation and far less opportunity to intersect with inspectors to get the sort of things that John was asking about, what's a good and acceptable level of practice? Are we facing a situation of less regulation in this new environment?
I would question whether there was a high level of regulation in relation to the safety of the people doing the work before anyway. My experience, even some of the local authorities in London who have got experience in it because they've got lots of events, the level of enforcement action they were taking on the issues around edge protection were minimal, if not non-existent, which is why it's still an issue for the industry. The advantage of having the HSE involved is you have a national organisation with all of the resources and the backup and the standard setting and all the other things all in one place. So now the problem's been highlighted, we'll have to move to a solution. So those problems will be solved. Whether some will take longer, some will be quite quick and quite easy to do, but they will be solved. In terms of the amount of inspectors on the ground that you see, local authority inspectors will still be there looking at licensing issues and looking at the event itself. And they have all been asked to tell us about things they spot that they think we should know about. And those concerns are fast-tracked through to our construction teams. So if there is a particular issue, they can get in touch with someone and we can send either a compliance officer or an inspector out to site to deal with it. Very much in the way that we do with the building control officers on normal construction sites. Because the ratio of inspectors to construction sites is probably worse than it is between inspectors and events sites. Far worse. But we use lots of different sources of intelligence to target our work. So we don't have an approach to inspection like HSE would have had when I joined 20-something years ago. It was about routine inspection, and we would judge how good you were and then how often we should come back as a result of our inspection activity. We draw our intelligence from lots of different sources to target the poor performers. So for example, one of the things we do in the construction industry on a regional level with smaller regional contractors is each team has 10 contractors on a list who are poor performers and need improving. And over a period of 2 years, they have to help improve those contractors or they go to court. Or maybe they potentially go to court at the beginning of that process and the middle and the end as well. So we target the people who need the attention. We leave the people who are better alone. We don't spend our time looking at the top tier of contractors in the construction industry on a proactive level. We do it reactively still. We have particular problems, whether it's an accident investigation or a complaint. We don't spend lots and lots of time looking at those companies. We don't do hundreds of visits across the whole country to very good performers. We spend our time with the poor performers. That sort of.
One of the issues that was highlighted yesterday to a great level and to an extent at the working group and in other forums over the winter is this question of competency and the fact that the events industry traditionally use people that don't have formal qualifications. And I'm just wondering where we could get some guidance to point the industry in the right way to establish those competencies and establish qualifications for the people who have obviously got the skills.
I'm not going to pretend that the competence issue in construction is all titty-boo and running smoothly. It's a very difficult area. The requirement for competence specifically in construction first came in 2007 with CDM rigs. And that has assisted the sort of explosion of card schemes. That's one example of competence in inverted commas. Some of those card schemes, like the construction plant operators scheme, in order to have a card, you've got to have achieved an NVQ standard. You can't renew unless you're at that standard. So that is a proper competence card of people demonstrating competence at a specified level with national occupational standards and all the rest of it. But at the other end, you can have a day's training on putting up a particular piece of kit and get a card that says you're competent, and actually you're not, you've been trained. So competence is not an easy issue.
No, it's not.
And we are very clear in HSE that we don't see having a card as being the only demonstration of competence.
No, I had a discussion with Jumbo last night, who's got an enormous amount of experience putting stages up. And I said to him, if you sat down with a crew member, you could find out in about 15 minutes whether he was any good or not, and probably 5 minutes if he was on site. So it's not a question of knowledge about competence, but it's a question of proving it in documentation and how we can establish training schemes. Who's going to pay for it? I know there's lots of funding available for training, but because we've never traditionally, I mean, PSA have had some schemes going, Muta have got their MVQ system going, But there is a big area out there, particularly with the larger structures and the stages, where there is no formal qualification of stage master or tent master.
The construction industry, construction skills are sort of the primary body in terms of competence in the construction industry, although there are other sector skills councils that impinge on construction. We did some joint research with them 2 years ago, which was released last year. It's called the High Tech Report. There's the company that did the research, which looked at the whole of the picture of competence across the industry and what particular problems were. One of the recommendations for that was a card registration authority. Now that isn't something for HSE to take forward, that's something for the industry to take forward. I think you will see in construction a lot of the lessons of how it's gone wrong being learnt and being remedied over the next year or two. There were issues around some of the card schemes that were sort of political issues that being ironed out, which maybe couldn't progress the issue much over the last 12 months. But I think you will see an industry learning the lessons of how not to do it and how it should be done. But maybe through our JACE working group, we can pick up on and help guide the industry. But it wouldn't be something HSE would lead. It would be something we expect the industry to take on for itself.
Who does the cap?
Gavin, I'm just picking up Tim's point about the gap, which I think exists. If I take any festival, a 3-week build and 2-week takedown, historically we've had a visit pretty much every day from the local authority. Because HSE were involved in the TDS, we really didn't get that. So we're missing 3 weeks of visits and another 2 weeks at the end where they're maybe coming every other day and watch what we're doing. I think that's going to be duplicated because local authorities are looking to cut back on their expenditure on festivals. If it's a non-licensable thing, and they're really concerned for the licence, apart from provision documentation, they're really concerned just about the running of the event. So there's a whole 3-week build with a 10-day, 1-week takedown, 2-week takedown, which we're not getting any business for. And I think most of us in this room, as Tim said, very much in favour of enforcement, in favour of legislation. But some people do need to have the stick rather than the carrot. I think that there's a lack of stick potentially. Particularly now, if you're looking at not doing major events, very confident about major events being run properly, and you're looking at smaller events, that means that the local authorities are going to think, actually, I don't have to bother because the HSE are taking on this, and we do structures, it's their problem. So there is a whole which was filled by the local authority.
Our analysis of the activity, the enforcement activity undertaken by local authorities predating the enforcing authority change was a drop in the ocean, tiny amount of enforcement activity. Very few notices, very few prosecutions. Prosecutions only when there'd been something horrendous that had gone wrong, and even then sometimes there were not prosecutions. So were these people inspecting the sites to look at the health and safety aspects of what was happening, or the actual event that was being put on? That
No, it's the build periods, and they are as occupational health and safety professionals from usually the environmental health section of the local authority. They would visit on several sites, not just Reading, on a daily basis. It wouldn't necessarily involve an enforcement notice, but their presence and the fact that they would do a report form and they would give us things that we need to improve was actually a bit of a stick, a bit of a carrot maybe for us to keep things moving in the right direction. And the danger of it, is this what you're saying, Tim? That's now been taken away. And we're very responsible, I think, as a client. But from other lesser festivals, maybe other festivals, there's nobody bothering. And it's much more self-policing, which I'm not against, but we've just removed that safety factor, which no local authority would come on site, often unannounced. Often, just people would know they were coming. Kept people on their toes a bit, and we've lost that.
I would take you back to the start of the construction programme, actually, because that approach of waiting for the HSE to come around and the safety advisor being given some ammunition to use against the principal contractor on the construction site or the client, so we've got to do this because HSE said we've got to do it, even though it's well known we've got to do it. That was pretty much where the construction industry was in the 90s. Now, that is not the case with the major players. The large sites, the large contractors do not behave like that. There's a totally different way they behave. I remember as an inspector in the 90s, I inspected things like the Channel Tunnel for 18 months, arguing with people on the Channel Tunnel about whether they should do this, whether they should do that, whether they should do the other, even though it was clearly what the legislation required. And us having to take enforcement action against them. Now I go to the UKCG United Kingdom Contractors Group meeting. It's the 35 biggest contractors in the country. And they've pushed far beyond what we're doing. They've gone beyond compliance. And it's not just safety advisors, it's the chief executive of Waits, the chief executive of Balfour Beatty. They want their industry to be exemplary. They're looking now towards zero harm, in the same way that the chemical industry would have been doing 20, 30 years ago. The industry has changed. Relying on regulators to tell you how to manage your job is not how to improve the industry. The way to improve it is to bring the industry together, agree the standards, and then where enforcement action and inspection can be best targeted in terms of the poorest performance and also the biggest impact on the wider scale, that's how you change an industry.
With respect, Gavin, that's not the point, because I think those of us that are working at a scale and with contractors and clients and suppliers in whom we have confidence, we are adopting exactly what we said, the industry is leading and being ahead of the game. But a lot of people in here are working in an environment, commercial environment, where they are trying to differentiate their good practice from the cowboys. There's always someone who will sell a cheaper product, get in a seasonal crew, whatever, and undercut them. And it's not a question of how do we regulate the good guys, it's a question of how do the good guys actually manage to maintain that commercial advantage of doing it right, because the inspection is falling away and there's no stick to hit the cowboys with it.
I agree, you do need an element of the stick, but I think that the point about working with the industry is that you are working with the clients as well. You are looking at the whole procurement chain, because some of the decisions that affect what happens on the site are often taken months. Probably the timescales are smaller in the events industry than would be in construction, but a long time before the first person turns up on site. So us targeting the whole of that procurement chain that's what has improved the construction industry. It's worked in an industry that was extremely resistant to change in the 80s and 90s. It was killing 200 people a year in 1990. It's worked there. It's our experience. It's worked in other sectors as well. It's working now in the waste industry, which again is That's a political issue about the way we choose to regulate in this country. It's not a decision that's made particularly by the enforcing authority. It's a decision about how the legislation works. No, because I don't think it's strange, because if you look at the rest of the construction industry, where they do temporary works, none of that happens for some enormous pieces of temporary works. We don't involve local authorities in that. Some of the concrete frame structures that go up. You could have 200 or 300 people working on a building site, or the Shard. How many people work in the Shard at any one time? You've got temporary structure, temporary support, temporary things going on there that aren't checked in the same way. If the Shard came down, it would cause far more damage than. So it's not that. It may well be for historical reasons, and the fact that it's connected to entertainment, and the licence is about entertainment events. It may well be that that's the way it's been regulated. But that isn't our approach to dealing with these particular with industry in general. That isn't how we do it.
We've reached the point where we're
all hungry.
Got to the lunch break. I've put the lunch off for 20 minutes. I didn't put it off anymore.
I'm happy to answer any other questions over lunch.
Yeah, I'm sure you'll get your ear bent. But I really want to express mine, and I'm sure your appreciation for both Gavin and Steve coming all the way up here today to give us the benefit of their experience. And having Gavin here has been absolutely fantastic. So thank you very much. We have an hour for lunch and then we're back on with it.